Hello, welcome. This session is part of International Education Week, which is hosted by the American Center in Moscow. International Education Week is a celebration of global learning and cultural exchange designed to expand horizons and foster connections across borders. It's held this week from November 18th to the 22nd, and it'll feature a diverse array of events, including lectures, workshops, and interactive sessions, where educators and students alike can explore the future of education and innovation. I'm happy to be here with you here today to host a session entitled Teaching Englishes for Real-World Global Communication. So this session is designed to help us think about what it means to be an English language educator in a globalized world, in which English essentially serves as a lingua franca. We'll be focusing today on deconstructing the notion of a standard English and considering how that deconstruction impacts the teaching specifically of pronunciation and spoken communication, and how we can shift to more inclusive multilingual and translanguaging practices. So that's a lot for us to do in just 60 minutes. And I want to leave time to answer any questions or ideas or comments that you may have towards the end. So let's get started. First, privyet. Hello, welcome, good evening. I know it's evening in Moscow. I'm in the Boston area, and you can see it's morning here. I'm quite happy to be with you today. My name is Dr. Rachel Toncelli, and I am an educator with more than 25 years teaching experience. I started teaching English in Europe many, many years ago in a British school. Though I am American, I currently teach undergraduate and graduate international students at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. Throughout my career, I've held a variety of roles, which I think have given me important perspective, including serving for many years as a TESOL teacher educator and as an English language learning program director at a university here in the States. So I just wanted to give you a little bit more background about Northeastern University, where I currently teach. As I mentioned, we're in Boston, Massachusetts, but we have over 20,000 international students coming from 147 countries, which is actually the second highest number of international students among United States colleges and universities. And here's just an image of our campus, which is quite lovely in the fall. We're an urban campus. But it doesn't always feel that way, which is kind of nice. So let me tell you a little bit about our plan for today. As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about this idea of a standard English. So the first portion of today's webinar will be on this idea of English or Englishes, and what that means and what the implications for teaching are, specifically focusing in then on translanguaging and multilingual practices. And then in conclusion, we'll think about final takeaways and just discussion. I'll open it up to your questions, comments, and ideas. Throughout today's presentation, I will be sharing some classroom activities and assignments, things that you could try. I know that we are welcoming educators from a variety of levels, young learners all the way up through university levels. So I've tried to come up with strategies that are applicable to what we'll be talking about, but also can be adapted to your particular age and grade level. So let's begin with English or Englishes. And I want to ask the question, just for you to think about for a moment, whose English is it anyway? So there really has been in recent years a shift in perspective and a shift in the sort of hierarchies of English over time. Just 25 years ago, when I began my teaching career, British English was really considered the gold standard of English, the kind of English we should all strive to attain. And that has shifted. We're seeing more and more that other varieties of English are increasingly valued and welcomed, which is lovely. I mean, certainly when I began my teaching career in a British school in Europe, speaking English with an American accent was often seen as a little bit less than. Something that I've seen over the years change significantly, which I think is nice. Though, even though the standard of English expanded to include other varieties, we've seen in the English language teaching profession that there really has been historically this privilege given to native speakers or native centered practices in English. And, that really is kind of exclusive of so many speakers of English that we are finally making this really wonderful move towards a recognition of Englishes, that there are so many varieties of English in a global language, and that we can and should use translanguaging practices rather than just English only immersion that has a native centered focus. So there's so much more we can do to invite other speakers in when we adopt this kind of positioning. And I think to understand this, we can sort of think of it this way. English spread around the world largely due to colonization, trade, people moving around the world. And it's important to keep in mind, Baker et al. Remind us that colonial ideologies associating English with just Anglophone countries may disempower rather than empower those who use English as a lingua franca in multilingual settings, where English use is typically different from an idealized and limiting monolingual standard native variety. So, it's important for us to keep in mind that certainly as educators, our goals are never to disempower our learners. And so we really want to be thinking about the many speakers of English in multilingual settings. And so we really should be thinking about global English rather than just a UK variety or an American variety or an Australian variety. Global English has 1.5 billion speakers, right? So the facts simply don't support us thinking about a monolingual standard when we recognize that only 360 million of those speakers of English are first language speakers. So roughly 24% of the speakers of English on Earth are first language speakers of English. The vast majority of English speakers are not first language speakers. So it means that English is the most studied foreign language. And interestingly, 52% of the internet, information on the internet, is in English. And so we can see that we really need to be thinking broadly about English. And I would advocate for us really thinking deeply about what we are preparing our students to do in English based on the statistics about global English. So I did a little bit of homework about the state in Russia and realized that English can be very valuable for employment within Russia. So according to Prashina, 30% of the job advertisements in Russia require English language skills. So certainly within the Russian context, English can be very important for employment. But it can also be important for access to scholarly and scientific work. Prashina again notes that 94% of scientific and scholarly publications are in English. So certainly access to that intellectual realm, English is a bit of a gatekeeper for it. And then finally, some of our students might be studying English because they are curious about studying abroad, about travel, or access to global pop culture, which is often in English. So increasing globalization leads to exposure to a great variety of accents and dialects of English. So when we put all of this together as we're thinking about how to best prepare our students or what we're preparing them for, ultimately the conclusion is that our students need exposure to diverse contexts, diverse uses of English. And what we can say is essentially that our students will need skills to communicate across these cultures and varieties. So just a few more points about English. If English is a common language that's shared by so many people across the globe, we have to keep in mind that a common language is not monocultural, monolithic. Rather, it's got to be a diverse and multicultural language. I actually think this is one of the more beautiful things about the English language, because it now gives us an ability to connect people across a great variety of contexts, settings, and cultures through a common language. And then I would say, furthermore, and perhaps most insightfully, is this statistic that comes to us from DaCosta and Rose, who estimate that only 4% of English language interactions in the world today contain solely L1 speakers. So only 4% of the conversations in English on any given day around the world happen between two speakers of first language English, which is a really, I think, powerful statistic for understanding what it means to say that it's a lingua franca, or a global language. And this has important implications for teaching. And that's what I'd like to talk about next. The first thing I would say that's really important as we're thinking about teaching for real world communication is seeking authentic and varied teaching materials. So here, it's important that when we seek out materials, we're featuring different English varieties. Certainly British, American, Australian, but also, and of equal value, Russian English, Singaporean English, Indian English, Nigerian English, Chinese English, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That listening to speakers from all of these varieties is really important to helping our students be ready for real world interactions. And just to return back to my context here at Northeastern University, I told you a little bit about the great diversity of our student population, but it's also great diversity of our teaching population. And so our students, or students who come here, need to be ready to hear not just Bostonian accents, but really all kinds of accents in English. And so we want to prepare students for that by exposing them to lots of authentic but varied materials. One way to do this is certainly, to the extent possible, inviting speakers to your classroom. So if within your community you have people of various origins who are speaking in English, or can come to your class and speak to your English, certainly that's a wonderful thing to do and a great opportunity for students to interact in meaningful ways. But if that's not possible, it is fortunately possible to use technology to open us up, to connect to diverse varieties. And so that can certainly be something of value. So let me give you a sample classroom activity that I often use with my college level students, but which can be adapted really to any level. And that is a listening journal. And so, this can be a good old fashioned paper and pen notebook, or it could be a digital journal, whatever works for your particular teaching context. But what I do with the listening journal is I invite my students to listen to varieties of English on the theme. So the theme could be something that we are studying in terms of content, or some kind of speaking context that we're practicing. And I have them listen frequently to speakers of English who, some who sound like me, some who don't, all kinds of varieties of English. And because my students are older, I can also allow them to select listening materials in areas that they're interested in, and encourage them to select listening materials online, through YouTube, TED Talks, podcasts, that are of interest to them. And then in the journal, what we do is we really just make notes about the similarities and the differences in areas of pronunciation, word choice, and grammar. But this note of similarity and difference really isn't about deciding what's a better or what's the standard. It's more about just working to understand it, exploring it with curiosity, and then sharing out and having the students come to class and share, and we discuss this regularly. It does take practice to listen in to other accents in English, and it's valuable practice because, as we know, more often than not around the world, people who are speaking English are speaking all kinds of varieties of English. Another activity that can be very useful in class is role-playing strategies for negotiating meaning. One challenge that students sometimes have when they're exposed to global English is that perhaps if they've only been trained to listen to a certain kind of accent or a particular variety of English, it becomes harder for them where they need help reaching out to other kinds of English accents, varieties, etc. So I will often design interactions that require the students to paraphrase and to request clarifications, because these are really good skills when it comes to thinking about in the real world, how do I negotiate meaning? What do I do when either someone doesn't understand me or I don't understand someone? How do I request clarification? How do I rephrase my ideas in a different way? And so in these role plays, I'll often select topics that are relevant to student interests and goals. And I can have them speak with peers, with students from other classes, with community stakeholders, with you, the teacher, who's an excellent model for English, obviously, and put them in scenarios that require them to negotiate meaning. And obviously, you can do this in ways that are age appropriate, since we're thinking about young children, early learners, all the way up to the university level. Students often will really enjoy trying on a different personality for size. It feels like a low stakes way to take some risks in a new language. Always after these kind of activities, I encourage my students to analyze how it went. What made the communication successful? Where was it difficult? And to think together about strategies for more successful communication. And always, always, I emphasize respect for all varieties and proficiency levels. So that's just sort of this inclusive way of thinking about language, that we're not saying, oh, the American, that's the new gold standard. No, no, not at all. You know, I said earlier, the British used to be the gold standard. I think all of the varieties are an interesting standard. There isn't one that has that capital S, making it the idealized standard. This language belongs to all of us. So it kind of begs the question, how do we teach pronunciation when we're teaching a global language with so many varieties and so many kinds of pronunciation? So traditionally, English language educators have focused on one of two kind of pronunciation patterns. The first being received pronunciation, or RP, which is traditionally ascribed to British pronunciation. But it's really important to note that if you really strictly taught received pronunciation to your students and then sent them off to the UK, they wouldn't actually be prepared for the reality of the UK, because only about 3 to 6% of UK speakers speak in that pronunciation, right? So there's so much interesting and fun variety of English pronunciation across the British Isles. And so received pronunciation is kind of just a tiny portion of that. Now, other schools of thought teach, okay, we'll teach general American, or GA, general American pronunciation. And here again, this general American pronunciation is a hard thing to identify. There is so much regional variety in terms of pronunciation. I mentioned I'm in the Northeast. I am in the Boston area. And so when I speak English, perhaps you can identify that in the way I pronounce English. And so I've also lived in the deep South here in the United States, where certainly my manner of pronouncing English was not there considered the standard either. So I think we can teach pronunciation, we can teach the International Phonetic Alphabet, and we can use one of these standards as a starting point. But we should keep in mind that it really doesn't reflect the way most people speak. So having the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, is a great tool for analyzing variety across pronunciation. And I think when we're teaching, it's important to position it that way. This is one form. We'll use it as a starting point. We'll use it as a tool, but it's really not something that you have to spend any great effort trying to mimic. So instead, what I tell my students, and what in my program we tell our students, is that we really welcome all varieties of spoken English. And we really don't think that the native speaker is necessarily the norm. We know numerically, statistically, it's not the norm. And it's also important to remind our students, something I remind my students very regularly, is that everyone speaks with an accent. And I think this is actually quite encouraging to language learners, and it needs to be repeated often. Because I think students will often make the mistake that their English language teacher is the perfect accent. And I like to tell my students there's nothing perfect about my accent at all. My accent is just a story of my geography, right? And as it is of everybody else's. And so having an accent that differs from some idealized standard is actually interesting because it tells your story and it tells your geography. So rather than focusing on trying these very rigid attempts to achieve native-like pronunciation, I would argue that it's more important to emphasize intelligibility, right? So rather than this, and it's in quotes, perfect pronunciation, because there is no such thing, we really should teach students accommodation strategies. In other words, focus on comprehensibility factors, word stress, key consonants, intonation patterns, rather than using a lot of your teaching time and their studying efforts to focus on accent reduction. I like to say I'm not an accent reduction coach. I'm just a person who's trying to encourage comprehensible communication, as I'm sure many of you are. So again, focusing on those comprehensibility factors can be really valuable because it's also a reminder to our students that if they have a successful communication, if they spoken or understood and understand what the other person is saying back to them, that's the successful goal of language. And so really being too rigid about how we teach pronunciation can have a detrimental effect on our students and on their desire to take risks in a new language, which we certainly don't want to do. I generated an image here on this slide of an old-fashioned radio where you had to tune into a frequency using the dials. And I think that's a great sort of metaphor for what I mean by emphasizing intelligibility, because, humans really, the human mind is designed to tune in to various accents. And that's a wonderful thing about us. And, I think we've probably all had an experience when we first meet someone in any language who speaks with a particular accent. Sometimes at the beginning, it can be harder to understand them. And then after just a little bit of time, we kind of tune in, we catch their frequency, and we are able to move forward and understand. So one thing I tell my students, if they are worried that their perceived accent maybe is harder to understand, a good trick is quite simply to encourage them at the beginning of any interaction to make an intentional effort to speak just a little bit more slowly, because speaking a little bit more slowly at the beginning does allow others to kind of tune in on their radio frequency, as I was saying. So let's think about a sample classroom activity relating to this. One thing that students will benefit for as they're thinking about real world communication and global English is this reaching for new accents and varying proficiency levels. So I like to have my students do listenings. I often will do them as homework assignments, but they can be in-class activities until the students get used to the process. But I use online recorded speeches, video clips, film clips, and when possible, I invite speakers to my classroom. So I wasn't 100% sure if we had access to the same recording. So what I would encourage you to do is just kind of hunt around on the internet for various accents if you don't have people that you can invite into your classroom. So here you can see an image of this really fun video that I've done with some of my students who, they're young college students, and some of them still really enjoy video games. And gaming is actually a really interesting global English space. And so this is a fun YouTube video that has, captures clips of people playing video games, but they're speaking all varieties of English and the challenges for the students to try to guess the variety. But that's just a fun example. But I'll often do whole listenings if we're doing a reading on a particular topic. I'll find a podcast or a TED Talk or a speech on that topic, and I will very deliberately look for speakers of English who don't sound like me to give my students opportunities to practice understanding new accents, understanding different proficiencies. And as your students are older or more mature or have very particular goals, one thing that you can do is allow them to choose topics of interest to them. Obviously, if you're working with young learners, you're going to want to have a little more control over what they're listening to make sure that it's age appropriate. But when you're doing these listenings, you're listening for comprehension, but you're also inviting the students to identify pronunciation features. And if you've taught the IPA, they have a tool for kind of capturing where sounds feel different or mapping intonation patterns, noticing vocabulary shifts across varieties of English. And that's not because students need to feel that they need to use all of these vocabulary shifts or all of these pronunciation features. It's more that they want to be able to take them in and understand them, or at least negotiate meaning with the person they are communicating with. So along this line, another implication for teaching is really this idea that we should be designing and assessing communication-focused tasks. So as I said earlier, we really want to be focusing on intelligibility over native-like accuracy. Achieving native-like accuracy may or may not be attainable for some students, but it really shouldn't be that important if people are intelligible. And so this is where I think it's been a big shift. It's been a big shift throughout my career. And I think in the TESOL field, I've been seeing this shift over recent years. And that is that we're trying to create, when we're assessing our students on their spoken language, we really work to create assessments that consider not a right versus wrong binary, right? Not looking to say, oh, I say this consonant this way and this vowel this way. You said it different, so it's wrong. That's the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. We're really trying to think about grading in a way that thinks about, is the pronunciation or some aspect of the pronunciation, does it impede understanding? Are we unable to understand? And if that's the case, what can we work on to make the student's speech more comprehensible, to support them in their communicative power? And so this is a big shift, because it, I think traditionally, a lot of English language education has focused on this, reaching towards that received pronunciation or the general American, which perhaps really is something we shouldn't be doing. It's a lot of energy that maybe isn't well spent or could be spent in other ways. Now, designing communication-focused tasks instead of precision pronunciation spoken tasks really does require that we adjust our rubrics accordingly. So one thing that we do in the program I teach in is really think about, whether it's in spoken English or frankly also in written English, because we can think about writing with an accent as well as speaking with an accent, is really asking the question, does this impede intelligibility, right? So there can be perceived errors, right? And errors really just being something that's different from the way perhaps we would use the language. But if that difference does not prevent us from understanding, it really isn't something we should focus on. And so that does require shifting the way we assess, shifting our rubrics accordingly. And I think what we've seen over the past years is that really encourages students, it empowers students to focus on sharing their ideas and connecting to other people, rather than using pronunciation as a gatekeeper or a barrier in our language development. So let me give you another example of a classroom activity or assignment that you might do with your students. Again, you might have to adapt this based on your particular age level, the students that you're working with. But I like to call these a day in the life presentations. Now, whenever possible, I try to have my students engage in real interactions. So with other people, with speakers of all kinds of variety of English. Now, I'm lucky that I'm teaching in a very urban context where, it's a very globalized campus, and I can easily connect my students to people within the community who they could interview, observe, connect to, and then come back and do a day in the life presentation. Now, I recognize that not everybody has, it lives and works in that same context. So if that's not a reality for you in your teaching context, certainly, again, you might be able to reach creatively into your community. Those people may not be in your school, but perhaps in your community, there are business people who work in international business. There might be people who work in the hospitality industry, who work in tourism, and just engage with people in English from a variety of places. I think I was reading the other day that there's been an increase in tourism in Russia in recent years from Asia. And so, again, this is just another example where we'll see those Asian tourists coming to Russia will likely, we can predict, might be using English as a lingua franca. And so someone who's working in the tourism industry might have all kinds of ideas about what it means to engage in global English. And they could be a great person for students to interview and then make presentations about. Now, if that's not possible, if those real live interviews in person aren't possible, there are so many other ways that you could think about doing this. And obviously, the internet does open up the world to us. There are lots of online videos across all kinds of contexts. Certainly, I was looking the other day for a day in the life in Singapore. I have a lot of students from Singapore, and I think Singaporean English is really, really fun and interesting to explore. And the students appreciated welcoming it into the classroom because they had familiarity in my teaching context with Singaporean English. And they were able to do this really interesting analysis. So another option for sort of gathering these day in the life presentations could be virtual exchanges to the extent that you can, connecting to educators around the world. The English language education field, I think, is a very friendly field. I think, it's one of the perks that we have as English language educators is really having colleagues around the world who share our mission for using language to connect people. So to the extent possible, connecting to educators of students in other countries where there could be an exchange, and then your students could kind of bring back and make these presentations about a day in the life. And what it does is it reminds students that there are all of these great varieties of English, and we can encourage students to then sort of think respectfully about the differences, right? So we're always setting it up as maybe the pronunciation we started with, because we were teaching the International Phonetic Alphabet, we chose a system, maybe it was received pronunciation or general American, but because we're constantly talking about that as one kind of English in a world with many Englishes, we're opening the door to value these other varieties of English and sort of deconstruct the standard or the fictional idea that there really is a standard. They're just local standards, really more than a universal standard. And so we're getting our students to think about these are just differences. They're not good or bad. They're just different. And actually, I would argue they're good. They're interesting. And we want them focusing on what was the strategy they used to negotiate meaning. Because ultimately, that's really how they're going to use the language in the real world. They're going to have to figure out how to negotiate meaning across all kinds of contexts if they're really using English in their daily lives. So I want to sort of shift now and think a little bit more about translanguaging and multilingual practices. For a very long time, the teaching of English was sort of took an immersion approach. That is, English only in the classroom is the way to go. If we want our students to acquire English, or really any language, it should be that target language only in the classroom. And really, as we think about advances in our awareness of how languages are acquired, and really just the humanity of our students and the relationship we're trying to build with our students, we've come to see that adopting a translanguaging stance, which values students' home languages and linguistic knowledge as a tool, as a foundation upon which we can build subsequent language, is actually a better approach, not just a kinder approach, but a better approach, because it's inviting students to use what they already know in the acquisition of new language. So let's shift our attention a little bit to these ideas. How do we teach English in a more multilingual way? So we want to build on translanguaging and multilingual practices. And to do that, we may have to abandon ideas we have that immersion is the only way to go. Because the use of a student's first language in subsequent language education can actually be incredibly valuable, because it allows them, the students, to access their full linguistic repertoires when we're inviting them to share what they know or build connections about what they know, connect something in their first language to something in this new language, right? We're building a house on the top of a foundation, as opposed to pretending that foundation doesn't exist and starting from scratch. When we do this kind of comparative work, we're actually encouraging our students to build meta-linguistic awareness, right? And by meta-linguistic awareness, I mean this ability to connect the new to what's existing in terms of their linguistic knowledge, and the ability to think about language, which can be very powerful, reflective positioning in terms of expanding what our students know. So sometimes we think, oh, if we use the student's first language, we're giving them a crutch, and that they won't be independent in English on their own. In reality, we can teach them to use their home language as a tool, and that can encourage them to take more risks. Fu has some really interesting research that shows when we are encouraging our students to use their first language before their subsequent language, they'll actually reach for more complexity. So essentially what I mean is, if you want your students to be talking about a particular topic in English or writing about a particular topic in English, it's perfectly okay. It's actually a good thing to do to allow them to kind of think about what they already know on that particular topic in any language. Let them write about it in their first language, and then let them write about it and speak about it in English. And Fu's research shows us that when we do that process, when we get to that final product in English, the students will write and say more, and they'll do so with greater complexity, because they've been given a moment to kind of collect their thoughts, confirm that they have knowledge of the topic, and really build their desire to be able to express that knowledge in the new language, in this case, English. And just as a reminder, also in our classrooms, when you have the ability, because you share a common language with your students, explaining complex grammatical topics or doing some of that meta-linguistic analysis can certainly be done, in your case in Russian. And that's a way to just connect this new learning to what the students already know, but also to build teacher-student rapport. And I would argue, in every teaching context, teacher-student rapport is essential to really having students feel confident to take risks, to try a new language on for size, and learn to express their own identity and ideas through that new language. So I think it's exciting to consider the ways that we can value and recognize students' multilingual practices in our own classrooms, and not feel like we're doing something terrible if we're not a full immersion classroom. As long as you're setting goals and final targets in English, it's okay if along the way, it's more than okay if along the way you encourage your students to use all of their resources at their disposal to reach that destination. So we'd like to say here in my program that it's important to partner with students to consider their language goals. Which means we really want to give them some agency, give them some choice when it comes to the approach to language learning, right? Again, we'll set that final destination, but let them think about how they want to arrive, what aligns with the way they like to learn, what materials could be valuable to them when it comes to thinking about what their particular goals are in English and why they might want to learn it. And really, it frees us to not have to police language use, right? It's not a bad thing if in our classroom, two students who share a common language are discussing an assignment or an approach before they do it in any language. And then they move on to getting to do it in English, because that might be the moment of support they need, the moment of clarification they need, the connection across languages they need to be successful. And ultimately, what we want is for them to be successful. So in closing, I would say it's really important to encourage thinking in any language, right? Your students should be free to think however they need to. They can use all of their linguistic resources to ultimately reach for final targets. And the final target can be the full presentation in English, the full written paper in English, but the pathway there can be flexible and build on what your students already know. So let me give you a sample classroom activity that I've had a lot of success with my students. And you can think about this activity in a variety of ways. It's essentially this: task transformation. So it can be taking a communication, a dialogue of any sort, and adapting it across a rhetorical situation. So one example, that it has more to do with register than global Englishes per se, but I think makes the idea clear, is I will often have my students take a text communication to a friend, figure out what the main purpose of the message is, and then transform that text to an email to a teacher or a principal or a business, right? How does the communication change when you change the audience? And in that case, we're really thinking about formality in language, word choice based on relationship, how we show respect, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of task transformation is also really useful when we're thinking about global Englishes. What does it mean if we take a particular dialogue or a particular, let's say, even text or email or paper or presentation, and we shift who the audience is? And that means thinking about getting the students to think about how language variety and local culture might impact communication. And maybe you make a different kind of word choice based on your audience. And if it's a global English audience, how do you reach for structures that will be more universally understood? Whereas if it's a presentation in English and your audience is Russian, where are the moments where you can translanguage and pull in just that perfect phrase in Russian because your audience could understand it, or uses English in a particular way because of who they are? So when we have students thinking about how they would adapt communication based on the rhetorical situation, we're really encouraging them to think about how communication can be respectfully inclusive of all kinds of Englishes, which I think is an exciting task. And I think the students often find it quite fun to do that. It gives them a sense of almost power over the language, that they can use it well enough to think about using it differently based upon the rhetorical situation. So we are moving now towards just the end of my turn talking, and we're going to lead to the discussion. I'll be looking forward to taking your questions and ideas, but I just wanted to share a few closing takeaways. What I hope to have achieved today in this conversation with you is that using a variety of teaching materials to reflect global varieties of English and real-world communication is very important. It allows us to challenge the notion of this single standard English, and sort of open up the doors to all of these great varieties and value all of these varieties, which I think is very empowering to our students. And to do this, it's important to focus more on intelligibility than precision. And by precision, I mean sounding like a particular type of pronunciation. But I would say that focus on intelligibility should always be in alignment with your students' learning goals. And so sometimes I've had students who, their next plan is to go study in London. And so they will focus listening activities and readings on British English because that's in alignment with their goals. And so everyone has different goals. And if we can customize, give students some choice in reaching for those goals, then we're really partnering with them in an interesting and exciting way. And finally, I would say that it's very important to recognize that our students have multilingual competencies, and that's important to value in our assessment strategies. That if they come into a spoken English assessment with a particular accent that reflects where they're from and what other linguistic resources they have, we should value that, and focus on their communicative ability rather than sounding like a particular type of English speaker. So thank you. Spasibo. I've really enjoyed sharing these ideas with you. And now I would like to use our remaining time to think about questions, comments, ideas. I'd love to hear from you. So I see a first question here is, I live in a small town in Russia and we don't have any native speakers here. Can you recommend any online resources where I can take my students to talk to native speakers? So to talk in a live interaction, I would say it's probably, I would reach out to actually other teachers in other places so that you could do a student exchange. I don't know of a platform where that could happen. But for listening activities, I would say that there's so much online. I think if you want to get a great variety of English, going to TED Talks, TED Talks, if you can access them, they have, phenomenal speakers and a great variety of content areas and backgrounds. So those can be incredibly valuable. And I also think that, there can be podcasts can be great listening tools as well, because again, you can find them in English on any topic from all over the world. And so listening ideas are certainly easier. And I see that the moderator just noted that the American Center in Moscow is also a great resource, of course. And they have lots of events and perhaps opportunities for clubs and exchange, etc. Let me read the full answer that the moderator just put here. The American Center in Moscow is a great resource. You can check the schedule of events on their website at amc.ru. You might be particularly interested in regular clubs such as Conversation Club, Debate Club, TEDx Club, Moment of Fame Club. The hosts of these clubs are native speakers, and you can subscribe to the newsletter to receive a weekly update. Okay, got another question here. Thank you for the amazing talk. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. My question is, how do we combine individual student goals when we have a large class or like students working in groups or a large class? Of course, that's totally fair. What I would say is something I try to do is I do have certain things that, because of my institution, certain goals that my students need to reach. But within that, when they have a particular assignment to do, say, a research paper or a presentation, within that, right? So like I'm required to hold them to a particular standard for their writing skills or their speaking skills, presentation skills. But I can give them agency in terms of the topic they pick. And I can support them through individual conferences to think about what their goals are and what topic they can pick and where they can find interesting materials. So you can sort of balance this. You do have to move the whole class forward with creating some spaces where it's possible for you to give them some choice in either the topics they study or the materials they use, or you could think about giving the students some freedom to design a particular project. You decide what the learning outcomes are. You have to achieve these particular language skills, but how you get there, we can negotiate that. And so that would allow your students to have a lot of creative projects that they present to the class, which would be, sort of a win-win for everybody. That answered your question. Okay, so we have another question coming in. What textbooks do you use for teaching English? I'm especially interested in introducing different Englishes to my students. So I'm really glad to hear that you're especially interested. To be honest, I don't use a lot of textbooks. I often will reach to sources online to find materials that have a great variety. So I can't advocate for a particular textbook. I'm sorry. But I think even if your school requires you to use a particular textbook, you can add to it, you can adapt. So if you're covering a particular language structure or content area in a given unit, maybe you can pepper in other people speaking on that topic by reaching for listening activities. Like I'll often bring in speakers of British English, and I love to bring in speakers of African English because the accent is so different and so lovely, and the students really enjoy that variety. I'll also use Toastmasters, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but you can find online. Toastmasters is a public speaking competition. And so they have just this amazing archive of great speakers giving speeches in English on all kinds of topics. They're not long, but there's a great variety of speakers of English in that archive as well. So I don't have a textbook I can advocate for, but I often pull in from lots of sources. So if you're using a textbook, you can still do that same thing. Okay, so what is my attitude to AI dialogues is the next question I have here. Oh, that's a great question. So AI is a really interesting place for thinking about English is. The reality is, though, AI, when we think about generative AI, large language models, they're trained based on just a corpus of human text. And a corpus of human text will have all of these varieties of English, but it will also have all the stereotypes, all the bias, all the things that we don't necessarily want. So what I say is I'm a fan of using AI, having it help me generate materials, teaching students how to generate materials. But I think that always has to be done with a critical eye. And so teaching them to recognize where bias exists, where stereotypes exist in AI generated content is a very valuable, I think that's just a valuable life skill right now, that critical AI literacy. So I'm definitely, I say use it, but use it with a critical lens and teach students to have that same critical lens. And just so as a quick example, what I mean is I was working on writing personal narratives, presenting personal stories in one of my classes. And I had the students generate a personal narrative about themselves, which was obviously a work of pure fiction, but it was important because it's one thing for me to say, oh, AI contains stereotypes and bias. It's another to see AI produce an essay about yourself and it had all kinds of really obvious stereotypes. So for example, my students who were from Colombia noticed that their essay was all about dancing and food. And they were like, well, yeah, there's great food and great dancing in my country, but there's so much more. And my students from China, every one of my students from China, their essay said they were studying computer science, right? So it was applying this stereotype. So giving the students experience seeing those stereotypes helps them learn that they need to use a critical lens as well. So let me see. I have another question here. In Russia, a general approach to teaching English and any language is prescriptive. We are told the rules and the mistakes are corrected with the red pen all the time. That's why many Russian students are shy and they're afraid to make a mistake. How to avoid this policing when teaching if I want the students to learn the language correctly, but I also want to make them feel confident when speaking? It's such a hard dilemma. Oh, it is such a hard dilemma. What I say about sort of this red pen approach to teaching English is this. I want my students to know that every mistake they make is an opportunity. When they make a mistake, either in speech or in writing, they're telling me where I can help them. So make all the mistakes you want. And I encourage them as a community in my classroom, if a student is struggling or stuck, to help each other. And so that prescriptive language, when I'm teaching the structure of language, I try to be less prescriptive, but I draw that line at where will it be comprehensible, and where, if I don't polish it or fine tune it, will it not be comprehensible? Or where do I want to make sure that if someone is going to judge me by my language first, which unfortunately happens, how can I put my best foot forward? And so I would say shifting rubrics is a really great place to start. And so instead of that, looking for, say, grammatical perfection or spoken perfection, I have my rubrics say things like grammatical errors or pronunciation errors do not impede meaning, right? Or they're not so many that they are distracting, because that helps the students feel like, okay, I can make some mistakes. I'm going to make some mistakes, but am I understood? And then I can fine tune my work along the way. And it also opens the door for students to feel more comfortable putting ideas out there, sharing, trying English on for size in their communication, which I think is really more important than that prescriptive approach. It's a shift in, I think, the way we teach. It's worth a shot. I see that it works. If you're constantly sort of, the drum that you're playing in your classroom is that mistakes are an opportunity, and we're only going to worry about the mistakes that prevent us from being successful. And sometimes successful does require grammatical accuracy. So in a high stakes moment, we want to be ready for that. Sometimes it doesn't. So thinking sort of with more nuance about that. The next question I see here is, in my bio, it says that I explore how English language educators develop critical AI literacy. How does your research on AI literacy intersect with teaching English as a global language in the field, in the classroom? Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. So yeah, obviously AI has taken the world by storm. So in recent years, I've been doing a lot of research into how students use AI, how teachers use AI, where are the pros, where are the cons, how can we balance this constantly changing environment we're working in? How does it intersect? I think that AI gives us this really great tool to actually police language less. So students who are taught to use AI with a critical lens, right, they can also learn to use it as a tool to help them fine tune the communications. So before AI was really out in the public domain, certainly I would get papers in from students where there were sort of very characteristic, let's say, grammar mistakes that I would see by their language background, right? We could sort of predict by language background what students might struggle with in the language. And those errors are just gone now, right? Because people can use Grammarly, they can use an LLM of their choosing to fine tune the language. And I'm okay with that, because that really does open us up to this. We're just looking for real world communication. If you can use AI to help you polish what you're working on so that I can focus on your ideas and you can feel confident sharing your ideas, I think that's fantastic. So I do think it can be used as a tool in alignment to think about these global Englishes, to worry less about being prescriptive in our approach to language education. Obviously, I say that all with a grain of salt because I think students really need a lot of support, transparency, and trust with their educators in this area to learn how to use AI as a tool to support their learning and not as a tool that allows them to circumvent their learning. And that's a whole other topic. Yeah, so I think that we are out of time at this point. Thank you so much for coming today, for your really insightful questions. I hope that you've enjoyed my talk. I just want to note that International Education Week continues, and that the next lecture in the series will be Strengthening Resilience in the Classroom, Building Emotional Strength in Students, and that'll be hosted by Joanna Spice on November 21st, 5 p.m. Moscow time. You can access the link in the chat. I believe the moderator is going to put the link in the chat, but you can also go to the American Center Moscow at amc.ru for more information to access other International Education Week events. So thank you so much. It's been my great honor to chat with you today. And I wish you just the best of luck and success in your professional endeavors.